The deadliest mass shooting by a lone gunman in U.S. history, 49 killed in a gay club in Orlando, Florida. Americans are depressingly familiar with this kind of story and the set-piece aspect of the subsequent media coverage. Reporters piecing together fragments of facts, eyewitness footage on repeat, voiced over by a parade of talking heads filling in the gaps. Major news stories have a way of growing beyond the event. The massacre in Orlando became a story about the country, about gun control, America's mortal fear of enemies within, and inevitably about the race for the White House. Many in the LGBT community are saying that journalists let them down in their Orlando coverage, resorting to familiar narratives about terrorism and what both presidential candidates were calling radical Islam, well before we got the accounts of the gunman's secret life in the closet. That wasn't going to change Donald Trump's rhetoric. Radical Islam was the story, and he was sticking to it. And according to a new study, the U.S. news media, the filter American audiences rely upon to try to make sense of the world, are largely responsible for providing the platform on which the Republican candidate now stands. Our starting point this week is Orlando.
In the first hours of the story, the American media was at its best.
There's breaking news at this hour from Orlando, where there are reports of a shooting at a nightclub.
It answered who, what, when, where, how. But that ended quite quickly, and the blame game began.
This is now being called a domestic terror incident.
The media wanted to grant ISIS responsibility.
The suspected shooter, Omar Mateen, called 911 after the shooting started.
Simply because there was one report of Omar Mateen pledging allegiance to ISIS.
But they weren't talking about the group that was targeted. And that, to me, kind of laid the bedrock of the coverage from there on.
Because beyond the who, what, when, where, and how is the why. And that was one of the questions where the initial coverage came up short. News crews had already converged on the mosque in Orlando.
What is this mosque like? What sort of preaching do you hear?
Reporters were digging into Omar Mateen's Afghan roots and his Muslim faith.
What triggered your son?
I am as shocked as you are.
When it turns out they should have been looking at his dating profile and focusing on the victims in order to understand what motivated the killer.
MSNBC's Chris Hayes visited an Orlando area LGBT organization, and that's where he met someone who claimed to have encountered the shooter on a gay dating app.
You recognize him from a gay dating app?
Yeah, I recognize him from Grindr.
And instead of being, well, this is terrorism, let's talk to terror analysts, they went to the scene and spoke to people and did a little bit of like old school reporting, right?
When you look at this crime and just imagine if the killer had not been killed, what would he be charged with? He would clearly be charged with a hate crime in this country. He was someone who was obsessed with hatred of gays and went to a gay club. Would he have been charged with terrorism? That's a very interesting question.
We're taking small snippets of anecdotes of what we've heard about Omar Mateen, and people were sort of transcribing it to what their preset sort of narrative about the shooting was.
We've been learning throughout the day about the gunman, Omar Mateen.
It's an example of the media immediately wanting to jump to who did it and what do we do. And I think a lot of that comes into the political response as well, and that the political response largely was to say that, hey, this is about either guns and gun violence, or, you know, many on the right were saying this is about Islamic extremism.
As predictable as the sun rising in the east, the Daily News blamed the NRA for this attack by connecting this dot that Omar Mateen, because he could buy a gun, could go into a club and start shooting people. And you have the New York Post, which is a more conservative paper, saying that this is ISIS versus the U.S. And that is a microcosm of American media, where we're so polarized that we could look at the same situation and come away with two completely different perspectives.
That debate was reflected through or projected onto the presidential election campaign via a question of terminology. Up until the Orlando massacre, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton had echoed the policy of the Obama administration in her refusal to use the term radical Islam, which she and the president both called inflammatory and therefore dangerous. Post-Orlando, Clinton changed her tune, used the term repeatedly.
Radical jihadism, radical Islamism, I'm happy to say either. Radical jihadism, radical Islamism, I think they mean the same thing.
And it echoed across the American airwaves.
Both Clinton and Trump have sort of seen an opportunity here to quote-unquote look presidential, because this is a moment of saturated media coverage where a lot of Americans feel like they do need sort of a strong leader at helm. And I think that the reason that both Trump and Clinton immediately went for the radicalist angle is because that's just the way that the political system of the United States and media system of the United States reacts to acts by Muslim Americans.
Well, you've also been reluctant to say we're fighting radical Islam.
Back in December, Hillary Clinton did an interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos where she said we should never use the term radical Islam because it blames an entire religion.
That sounds like we are declaring war against a religion.
Then, just yesterday, she said, I have no problem saying radical Islam. And the reason why is there is no more Bernie Sanders in this election. There's no more left wing to appease because the opponent is different. So in this case, Donald Trump does, for lack of a better term, benefit here.
Radical Islam.
That so much of the coverage of a story that started in Orlando turned into coverage of Donald Trump should come as no surprise. A study released this past week by Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Media concluded Trump is arguably the first bona fide media-created presidential nominee. Although he subsequently tapped a political nerve, journalists fueled his launch. The conclusions were based on the disproportionately large amount of airtime and ink Trump attracted on 8 U.S. media outlets, what is called free media, and the tone of the coverage. He received far more good press than bad. And the study did not even include CNN, Fox, or MSNBC, news channels that have 24 hours of airtime to fill every day and gorge themselves on Donald Trump.
The media would literally set up news cameras at his events and just play his rallies live.
Let me interrupt you because the candidate has just appeared at the microphones at Trump Tower.
Anytime he makes an outlandish statement, that statement becomes saturated media coverage.
Many in the media did not do the kinds of stories they should have been doing about Donald Trump early on, what they call the deep dive on Donald Trump, the kinds of stories we're now seeing coming out about Trump University, about his business dealings, because they didn't treat him seriously. However, there was a recklessness in the way that they still gave him an enormous amount of time and attention because they knew that he was good television.
Some networks like CNN are attempting to do live fact-checking. NBC earlier this week fact-checked him on air.
There were a few errors in that speech, and we should point them out.
One of their broadcasters just started fact-checking Trump, and there can be an argument that, like, well, it's too late. Trump has the platform.
They didn't do the vetting. They didn't do the stories they usually do, and they gave him enormous access. I think it's less media manipulation and more media malpractice.
Consider where the story in Orlando began and what it has since come to be. There was the initial terrorism narrative based on the gunman's faith, before the facts, the apps, and the interviews made it more complicated than that. A tragedy quite possibly born of homophobia and self-denial. But by that time, the candidates had had their say, and that term, radical Islam, was back in vogue, where it will doubtless remain. Never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Never let them get in the way of a dominant narrative.